Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Friday Ramblings. And let's have some fun because we are getting straight into it with some classic comic book crossover chat. Ooh, classic comic crossover chat. That's a lot of C's, but we're not talking about a C grade story this time. No, we are talking about a truly important story for the development of an entire era of DC. We are talking about the Legends crossover. Now, what makes the Legends crossover so important? Well, a couple of things. First off, it was the first major company-wide crossover event after the Crisis on Infinite Earths, which ushered in the modern age of comics after the Silver Age. So again, I've discussed this before. I just want to throw this out here. I really wish there was another term for that. I know some people just say post-crisis era because we've had, the Infinite Crisis and Final Crisis and New 52. But, for a long time, that's what it was. It was like golden, silver, modern. It's like, dude, you're not even following the naming scheme. I guess I didn't want to say bronze because at that point it looks like they're ranking eras. But it is what it is. But it was the post-crisis era, and it helped set the stage for a lot of what happened in the post-crisis era. Let's get into the basics of the plot, and we'll discuss the fallout. Legends ran from November 1986 to May of 1987, and featured a core 6-issue miniseries called Naturally Legends, as well as crossing over with about 16 other issues involved in the event, including issues of Batman, Superman, Green Lantern Corps, Blue Beetle, and various others. Now, the series itself was plotted by John Ostrander, scripted by Len Wein, penciled by John Byrne, and inked by Carl Kessel. What makes this interesting is that this was early into John Ostrander and John Byrne's runs at DC. In many ways, this event served as a coming out party for these two, along with Len Wein, who, although had served a lengthy tenure at Marvel, had already been in DC for a while. And of course, Carl Kessel is a icon of DC, having started there in 1984, which may have only been a couple years ago, but had already made his name as an inker. The plot is very simple in theory, but very powerful on social messages, especially in the mid-80s. The idea is that new god Darkseid makes a wager with cosmic entity the Phantom Stranger that he can turn humanity against its heroes, proving that when all is said and done, evil is more primary to sentient life in the universe than good, and therefore Darkseid, being the epitome of evil, is correct when it comes to the things he does, and that it's the proper way of the universe. See, this is what Darkseid was all about in his early appearances, was not just being a super badass, but that he ran an entire planet that had a culture, and as such, he was often trying to spread the culture beyond his own planet, and in the process, justifying his planet's culture. Justifying their culture because they believe they're correct. What does this sound like something that occurs in reality? I think it might. Now, in order to win the bet, Darkseid sends his minion Glorious Godfrey, who was his chief of propaganda to Earth. Where Godfrey uses the sound of his voice, controls people's mind and turn them against heroes, portraying himself as a social activist, using the alias of G. Gordon Godfrey, which itself was a reference to the real-world G. Gordon Liddy, an American lawyer, FBI agent, who was convicted in the Watergate scandal as a chief operative during the Nixon administration. Again, the real-world parallels. Somebody who did a lot of talking, but not saying what he's really saying. Ooh. As I said, it's a very socio-political heavy story. Now, it is not enough simply to send a master of propaganda and public relations to turn the minds of the entire people of Earth against their superhero saviors. You've got to get a little more violent. Thus, Darkseid sends a fire elemental known as Brimstone to Earth, who defeats the then Detroit-based Justice League, along with Helper Firestorm and the time-traveling Cosmic Boy. Darkseid also has his cyborg minion Macroman fight Captain Marvel in a setup where, when Captain Marvel, also known as Shazam in modern comics, uses his lightning to transform back to Billy Batson, Macroman is seemingly slain, thus making the previously pure-hearted, always does his least violent solution best, Billy Batson, to now look like exactly what Godfrey was preaching against: excessively violent, amoral heroes. This causes Billy to be afraid to turn back into Captain Marvel / Shazam. I know, we know him now as Shazam. I'm going to probably just say Captain Marvel because that is how he's referred to in the story. So, for those of you who do get inspired by this to go and read the story, that's the name you're going to hear. But yes, it causes Billy to be afraid to turn back into Captain Marvel, partially so he can hide from the authority figures because people didn't know Billy was Captain. They were just looking for the Captain. But partially because he feared his own power was causing him to do things that he should not be doing, and he did not want to hurt anybody else in such a fatal manner. All of this leads to President Ronald Reagan, because DC was using the real-world presidents for their fictional stories. You know, it's a thing. To declare martial law and ban all superheroic activities in America. However, several members of Reagan's Department of Defense, being persuaded by Amanda Waller, activate Project Task Force X as government-approved and trained superhero operatives. But since superheroes in general are now persona non grata, and more importantly, the kind of missions the government are interested in are usually ones where agents may not come back, well, it sounds like Task Force X is more of a Suicide Squad. Woo! We know that term. It's shown up in movies recently. And therefore decides to use incarcerated supervillains to fill out the team. The team is then sent to destroy Brimstone, which they eventually manage to do. Although being a fire elemental and an artificial creation of Darkseid, Brimstone would reappear in other stories later on over the many years. Ultimately, Dr. Fate is forced to intervene when Godfrey uses his army of followers to invade Washington, D.C., backed up by massive, like we're talking the size of real-world military tanks, cybernetic warhounds, to back up his protesters. See, now we're getting really dangerous here. All this in an invasion of Washington, D.C. Dr. Fate organizes a superhero team composed of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, the aforementioned Captain Marvel, who has been re-inspired to heroism after meeting with some young children and understanding just how much of an inspiration he actually is, along with the other best of the heroes. Guy Gardner, Black Canary, Changeling, The Flash, and Blue Beetle. Should be noted this time this is the Ted Kord Blue Beetle and the Wally West Flash, for those of you keeping track with your legacy identities. They are later joined by Martian Manhunter, who responds to a distress call directly from the President. Superheroes manage to defeat Godfrey's forces, especially the cyborg Hounds of War. However, the masses are not so easily broken out of their brainwashing. This culminates when the previously grievously injured by violent protesters Robin, Jason Todd, aka Robin 2, again, for those of you keeping track of legacy identities, good on you. Clap, 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 clap. You've been paying attention to our early legacy videos, and there may be more to come later. But yes, when a still somewhat injured Jason Todd gathers a group of children to counter the protesters, Godfrey gets aggravated and strikes Robin, who, besides being clearly injured, is not technically superpowered, as we recall. This causes the mob to break free from his power, as he has now done something completely contradictory to the messages he has put out, and demonstrates that he is not something that they agree with. He has been lying to them. Thus, Godfrey has no army to back him up, no crazy alien weaponry with the Hounds of War destroyed, and he is subsequently defeated partly by his own arrogance. I will not give you the exact details because, again, minimal spoilers, folks. Thus, the world is saved, and people realize that, well, yes, superheroes can occasionally do a bit of wrong. They are certainly worth having over the alternative, as they do represent the best of our values. In the aftermath, the Martian Manhunter, Batman, Blue Beetle, Guy Gardner, Black Canary, Captain Marvel, and Dr. Fate decide to form a new Justice League. Superman the Flash declined full membership, stating that, however, that they will assist if needed, becoming implied reservists. Wonder Woman herself quietly exits, and Changeling decides to go back to the Teen Titans. Now, how important is all this? Well, here's the thing to understand. Wonder Woman was one of those characters who had their origins and history completely rebooted by the Crisis on Infinite Earths. She was, post-Crisis, a back-to-square-one hero, but more importantly, this series was released simultaneously with the release of her solo series, and this story served as her introduction to the greater superhero community. Thus key to Wonder Woman mythos fans. As we said, this iteration of heroes would band together to form the Justice League. This would be the one made famous by Keith Giffen. in which it was a more light-hearted take, except for a few dramatic stories for the sake of, tying into the greater DC, and eventually leading to the restructuring of the Justice League books as they created different spin-offs, but that's a thing for another time. We also got the formation of the Suicide Squad, who would begin their own series, and this was the official post-crisis introduction into the DC universe of Captain Marvel, as previous to the crisis, he and his related heroes had been isolated to their own Earth S. This not only brought Captain Marvel back to, or introduced him into the post-crisis single Earth concept, but served as a way to redo his origins and history from the beginning. This was done partly through the Shazam! The New Beginning miniseries that would be released shortly after Legends. So you have the first official post-crisis Justice League, and one of the most iconic runs of it starting. You have the debut of the Suicide Squad as a supervillain-based team. There had been a Suicide Squad published in comics before this that was genuinely heroic scientists and soldiers, and subsequent to Legends, flashback stories would be told with various World War II era soldier squads referred to as Suicide Squads or Suicide Squadrons. But the idea that most people think of now when they think of DC's Suicide Squad, God, how many times can I say this? As a group of villains, partially blackmailed, partially seeking potential genuine reform, or at the very least, reduction of their prison sentences, started here in Legends. And John Ostrander would be key to cementing this concept in the Suicide Squad comic. You also got the post-crisis full-blown introductions of Shazam and Wonder Woman. This, it's a thing. It's not the most immediately remembered crossover event by most modern fans because, again, most people think of the post-Legends fallout, not the story that kind of set all this stuff up, because these were some of the all-time great books of the 80s and early 90s. However, it all did begin here. Also, as I said, the fact that a large chunk of this book, especially in the crossover issues, deals with the socio-political ramifications of the public's loss of faith and trust in superheroes, superheroes themselves being forced to take a philosophical look at what they are and what they represent morally and ethically, and most key, the very real-world parallels to Glorious Godfrey and the idea that a charismatic person, given enough TV time and who knows how to phrase his words, can influence people to do things they would not do under any other circumstances, to the point that they are going to the very edge of violating their own moral and ethics codes. It was only the striking of innocent children at the end that snapped people out of it, as that was an act of true villainy, and thus Godfrey was exposed as not being better than the heroes he had been bad-mouthing. Let's be honest, during the 80s, for those of us who lived through it or have looked back on it, this was a very powerful social message, and maybe part of why a lot of folks now are not inspired to read it. There's this whole keep politics out of my superhero fun movement, but you know what? You really need to read Legends. If you're interested in the post-crisis, pre-Infinite Crisis DC, especially, more importantly, the post-crisis pre-Zero Hour DC, while, this set a lot of stuff up, especially when it comes to the tone of the books and the way the crossover events would work. This is a story worth reading. Yes, it may make you stop and think about the way you deal with, media talking heads and how much you trust what they tell you. But no matter what you take from this book, look, it's always worth it to question. That's part of why we here at Roulette Productions do not get too heavy-handed with our opinions. I present you the stories as they are. I may tell you my personal take on them, which is I rather enjoy the core Legends story. Some of the tie-ins are not as good as others, just because so much of the story was being told in the core series, and it was very philosophical based story, not a super action packed based one. But the core miniseries, and I would say the tie-in issues with the Justice League, the Batman Detective Comics ones, are certainly worth reading. The Superman ones are good too. Ultimately, he's still Superman. There's only so much loss of faith people are going to have in Big Blue, but there is some interesting stuff done there. Some of the others, like Firestorm, Blue Beetle, not as quite as essential, but still, if you find the collection on a nice little digital service, even if it's just the 6 issues core series, read it. I will say that it's worth giving a chance. But you are free to make up your own mind. If you've read it and hate it, tell me in the comments. I'm always happy to hear your comments and takes on my takes. And with that, I'm going to leave you alone, at least till next Friday, because there's always more rambling to do. There's always more entertainment to bring to you, especially in the hopes that you give something new a chance. Give new things a chance. Don't worry about if they make you think a little bit afterwards. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world that can happen to a person. Like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Bless me out on social media if you want to. Hey, I'm a chill guy. I'm not going to worry too much about it. But no matter what, when it's Friday, we'll ramble. And until then, I hope everybody who watches stays happy and healthy. Bye-bye.